IVM.
How did India go from less than 5 million landline phones in 1990 to over 1.2 billion phone connections in 2019 and over 500 million 3G and 4G users? India's telecom industry is perhaps the poster child of economic liberalization today, even though it did not grow as much as people hoped it would in the 1990s. It's also a sector with extremely complex laws, licensing arrangements and rules, and even so it has resulted in one of the most competitive telecom sectors in the world, with voice and data services being among the least expensive. Rahul Matthan returns to the Pragati Podcast to explain India's telecom revolution. Welcome to the Pragati Podcast, a weekly talk show on public policy, economics and international relations. I'm your host, Pavan Srinath. Rahul Matthan is one of my favorite guests, and this is his fifth appearance on the Pragati Podcast. He was previously here in episodes 53 and 54 to talk about the evolution of privacy in India and the world. In episode 64, he was here with Manasa Venkatraman to unpack the Aadhaar judgments by the Supreme Court of India. Before we get started on our discussion, I'm absolutely delighted to share a fantastic new podcast, States of Anarchy by Hamsini Hariharan. Hamsini is a foreign policy researcher, a former colleague, and Hamsini and I together got to create the Pragati Podcast, which she co-hosted with me for a long time. I know many of you listeners would have missed her, and now you'll get to listen some fantastic episodes with her every week. States of Anarchy is also on the IVM Podcast Network and available on all your favorite podcast apps. Subscribe today. We'll start our conversation with Rahul Matthan after this short break.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another awesome week on the IVM Podcast Network. If you aren't following us on social media, please make sure that you are. We are IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. If you are following us on social media, I'm sure you know that it's our 4th anniversary this month. Yeah, IVM is 4 years old. We've done 3,500 plus episodes of content, and it's been an amazing ride with a lot of fun guests, a lot of fun content, and a lot of great hosts. We'd like to thank all of our hosts because without them, we wouldn't really be doing all that much. Also, I'd mentioned over the last couple of weeks that we're running a survey right now, a listener survey. It's on ivmpodcast.com/survey. If you have not filled that out, please do fill it up. It'll help us figure out what is working for you, what's not working, and will give us some information that we can use to get some advertising on the show. On the Scene and the Unseen, Amit Verma is joined by author Srinath Raghavan. They discuss the recent tensions between India and Pakistan, its historical context, and what the future may hold. We're launching a new show called States of Anarchy about global affairs, hosted by foreign policy enthusiast Hamsini Hariharan. On How to Citizen, we move on to Chapter 8, Confronting Marginalization. Meghnad and Shreyas are joined by creative director Joel Pereira, who draws from his professional and personal experiences to discuss the topic. On Advertising is Dead, Varun talks to executive editor of Rolling Stone, Nirmika Singh, about new age journalism, what it takes to be a music journalist in India, the rise of Indian hip-hop, and a lot more. Also check out last week's episode with Gaurav Kapoor, founder of Oak Tree Sports and former VJ, who talks about his journey to becoming a sports presenter and what's missing in our sports content. On Golgappa, Tripti is in conversation with musician Karan Chitra Deshmukh. He talks about how he got into playing instruments and gives a glimpse of his talent on the show. On Geek Fruit, Tejas and Jishnu talk about their favorite classic TV shows and give their opinions on which can be potentially revived. Also check out last week's bulletin where they talk about IVM's 4th anniversary and their favorite shows on our network. And with that, let's continue with your show.
Hi Rahul, welcome back to the Pragati Podcast.
Thanks for having me again.
Rahul, we've talked to you about various aspects of technology in past episodes. We've talked a lot about privacy and data protection and so on. But today we're going to go one step back from this data revolution and everything that's taken place in the last, 10 years or so. And I want to talk about this Indian idea of leapfrogging. Right? So we often pride ourselves sometimes. I don't know how misplaced that pride is or not, that we leapfrog over, big box retail directly into online retail and e-commerce. We leaped over industrial growth directly into a large services sector. But one of the biggest leapfrogs has been from wired telephones directly to cell phones, and perhaps even computers, we leapfrog directly to smartphones. Right? So how did this journey start? I mean, I've heard stories of people waiting years and years for a telephone line connection back in the day before liberalization, to where we are today in 2019, where we have more than 1 billion cell phone connections, more than 500 million smartphone connections. How did we really come here?
Okay, that's the answer to that is one whole hour. So maybe we'll have to break this up into a little bit. So you're absolutely right. I think India is known for leapfrogging, but leapfrogging is not necessarily a compliment. In that the time that you leapfrog, at least the way I understand leapfrogging, is that for some reason the country has not caught up with the growth of technology elsewhere in the world. And then suddenly leapfrogs a generation of technology development into the current generation of technology development. So in that sense, the country misses out the benefits of organic growth.
Right.
And as a result of missing out that benefit of organic growth, sometimes misses out on some of the learnings that come with that sort of gradual transition from one state of technology to another. But the benefits, of course, are that it can, if it's smart, pick up the mistakes that happened along the way and just completely leapfrog over all those mistakes. And also, in a sense, learn from the way in which the rest of the world dealt with some of the challenges of new technology, and then, maybe avoid all of those when they come, to the final state. And so the most talked about example of leapfrogging is our telecom sector, where throughout the world, everyone was connected, nations were connected by wireline telephone services. And India, in 1991, I think they must have had something like 5 million connections. Today, as you said, we've got over 1 billion, maybe close to 1.2 billion telephone connections, of which the vast majority is cellular mobile telephone. So we just leapfrog that whole era when other countries were connected physically. And so, you had to go to a physical place to make a call, to a situation where everyone has a phone with them at all times.
Right.
And that has its own, pluses and minuses. So that's, I guess, the situation we find ourselves in, and warts and all. We've got to figure out, how we deal with some of those things.
So here, sort of my rough thinking around this has often been that, our political economy around technology is such that, when new technology slowly comes in, the adoption rates are very slow because, you have all kinds of regulations, very old laws perhaps that inhibit this, and also a predominant role of the state that was there in India till at least the 90s and even beyond in many sectors, right? So maybe that pace was slow and you needed some technology that was disruptive, sort of came in and then could propel some of this growth. But even there, if we look at, say, the information technology sector and, the IT boom that happened in the 90s and so on, that was largely in an environment where the government role was quite small. Perhaps apart from providing some high-speed internet connectivity to a small set of commercial entities and maybe power and so on, we didn't have a Ministry of Information and Technology, right? We got an information and tech sector before we got a ministry around it. Whereas that's not the case with telecom, right? The government had to take active interventions in order to get to where we are, even if it is actively trying to get out of the way. Is that fair? Could you tell us about how this started from 1990, where if you're talking 5 million wired connections for 200 odd million households, so that's 2.5% of India connected, to now 75% of India, some fairly large number being connected? How, what brought this?
So I partly agree with you, and let's, so if I could just break it down, I think you're right. I think the government recognized that it was not being successful in actually getting telecom penetration in the country. And so in 1994, the National Telecom Policy of 94 said that we would, as a country, make a push towards getting private sector involved in the telecom industry. And at that point in time, there was this new technology that had come out that the rest of the world was using, which was based on having many towers spread out across a location and transmitting it using those towers. So there was no fixed line network that required to be rolled out. I guess if they were looking to roll out private sector participation in fixed line telephony, that would have been a much more complex thing to give up to the private sector, because that would have involved rights of ways and all sorts of other things, which is very naturally something that the government holds. So I think the first element was there was a technology that didn't require giving private players the ability to access your home or the ability to dig trenches that crossed through the roads, which would have been the requirement if it was wireline. And also, at the same time, I think the government was perhaps not keen on investing in doing that itself. And if these two things came together, they said, okay, we'll allow the private sector to get into this. And the first round of licenses were only to the metros. And then within a year, in 1995, the licenses were opened up to another 18 circles or so. And in those days, the government was a little circumspect around how they did it. There were a lot of restrictions. The early licenses, you weren't allowed to have more than 3 circles. Each company wasn't allowed to have more than 3 circles.
Okay.
And there were restrictions around the number of players within a circle. And of course, at this time, the telcos not only had to get subscribers, they actually had to build the infrastructure. And the infrastructure was these big towers that they had to put. And there's a bit of a chicken and egg here, because you want the customers in order to fund your rollout, but you're not going to get customers if there are parts of the city where they take this phone and they can't use it. And so there was that challenge.
Like you need to get the network
in order to have enough subscribers.
Yeah.
And so it's a problem when you're rolling out a greenfield project. And I think kudos to the initial companies that were brave enough to get into this space. They actually went and rolled out the network. And much of the success of Indian telecom today is the fact that there were a few companies that took that effort to roll out the network, just relying on what they perceived would be the success of the sector when there was no evidence to back that up at the time. And so it's not like the government was heavily involved in regulating the sector at that point in time, because I don't even think the government recognized the extent to which it would grow. But the government did a few things, either by accident or by design, which resulted in the explosive growth of the sector. I think the first thing they did was they focused on coverage and penetration. It was a goal for them.
Okay.
And so they designed the regulations so that, as I said, you only had the ability to have a few circles, which meant that everyone didn't gravitate to the most lucrative circles. In those days, you would have thought the lucrative circles would be the metros.
Right.
Delhi, Bombay, Chennai, and Calcutta. These were the 4 cities that had the largest populations, and so that would have been the place. And also the more affluent, the more cosmopolitan crowd, and that would be the part of the country where everyone would have got a lot of profit, and so everyone would have gravitated there. But they said, no, you can't. And some people got the metros, but if you wanted to participate, you also had to pick up some of the other circles.
So it's sort of like with airline licenses as well, right? Oh, you fly the profitable routes, but you
Correct.
also have to fly a few flights from, tier 2 cities and so on.
Well, not exactly in that, the same, so you could end up not getting a metro at all.
Okay.
Which means you ended up with, let's say, Karnataka. So in Karnataka, in the first circles, it was GTM and what then became Spice. I think I can't remember if it was something else before Spice. But the GTM eventually got acquired by Airtel, and Airtel, has since I think the second or third round of licenses has been in Karnataka for all that time. And so by ensuring that people that there were players in every part of the country, they ensured that we'd get coverage. And then at that time, you needed to demonstrate within a specified period of time, 1 year for the state or the district headquarters, and then another period of time, you have to get 90% coverage of the rest of the area. So there was a lot of pressure on the telcos to actually roll out their towers and their infrastructure in order to get that kind of coverage. And as a result of that, we actually saw the telephone towers come up all over the country very, very quickly. Otherwise, we would have had all the main cities with this, but none of the rural hinterland with it. And That, I think, is one of the big reasons. Yeah, and it's strange to us as we think about it from our current context. But earlier, and we'll get into the details of how and why, but earlier you'd have to bid on the license and you'd get the spectrum for free. And then if you can show that you've built a certain amount of coverage and penetration, you'd get additional spectrum. I mean, this is how it was supposed to work. It didn't always work in the same manner, but as a result of that, there was a lot of incentive to, build out the network.
And what was the license fee regime? Because now we see auctions and so on, but how did this sort of start off?
So the auctions came in only after the 2G, after the 3G auctions,
Right.
And then the 2G scam and all of that. But the very first model was a fixed fee model. So you would, what the government would do is it would, in the early auctions, in the early license bids, they would say, look, this is what we expect would be the subscriber base. And this is what the growth of the subscriber base would be over a period of time. Bid for what you think this would be on a fixed fee basis, and there was a staggered payment rate that had to kick in. Of course, what actually happened in those initial days was that the growth of subscribers was far lower than what the government had anticipated, and quite frankly, even the telcos, because they had bid, obviously, whatever the price was reflective of how accurate they thought that the government's anticipation was, but it was far lower. And so, the telcos were bleeding really, really badly with this fixed price rate. And so this is the other thing that the government did well at this point in time. I think it realized that their initial model was flawed, and they were smart enough to change it to a license fee model. And so this was a revenue-based license fee.
Okay.
So they came out with this concept of adjusted gross revenue, which said that whatever your revenue is, we will adjust it basically only for tax and nothing else. So it is the gross revenue, and it is a gross revenue of the company, which meant whatever business you had alongside it, all of that gets rolled up into the revenue, and then there was a license fee on that. I think it was 15% in the beginning, but then there were always many slabs. It depended on the service that you provided, and there was a different level of a license fee. This persists till today.
Okay.
And you still have an AGR-based revenue that the government gets out of it. And this comes from the premise that spectrum, which is what drives all of this, is a national resource, and that the government is licensing spectrum for telecom companies to use, and in return for that, the government gets a fee. The fee now it will vary, but it's roughly about 8% of AGR. And the AGR model still remains, which means it's still gross revenue.
And this is in addition to those auctions that we hear about.
Yes, and so the auction is for the spectrum, and every probably on a quarterly basis, certainly on a biannual basis, there is a requirement to do an audit of what your revenues are. So I think the interesting thing about this is that this change actually brought back some life into the system, because now you're actually paying on use. You're paying
Right.
on the basis of what you are being paid. What it also did was a lot of the telcos used to sell handsets, bundle a lot of businesses along with this, and they very quickly realized that if you do all of that, then the revenues of all of that is going to get included. And so a lot of telcos actually hived a lot of things off. They moved off the handset business and all the other businesses out into separate companies. So telcos today are multiple companies. And
Right.
the reason is because AGR is calculated on the gross revenue. And you've got to strip that down to as little as you can.
So alongside, I guess, even competition and the scope for competition increased then, right? Because now you had an unbundling of, say, handsets and the telecom service provider. So more companies could perhaps enter the handset game and other parts of this game.
Yeah, but leave that aside. I think we had so many so many different rounds of licenses that at a time now is slightly different. India had more telecom players in each circle than any other country in the world by far.
Wow.
So the level of competition in the Indian telecom sector has always been extremely high. And this is the pure play telecom sector. So most countries don't have more than 4 players.
Okay.
India now, with the active players, is down to 3 or 4, depending on how you cut it. But at its height, we used to have maybe 12, 13 players in some of the big circles. And there's a big problem with that because as a result of that, the available spectrum was shared among a large number of people. Now, the way telecom works is there's a sort of a logarithmic effect of the amount of spectrum that you have. It gets better if you've got what they call contiguous spectrum, which is bands of spectrum which are actually close to each other. And most operators had the bare bones amount of spectrum, and they had to support larger and larger populations on that. And as a result, all these things we hear about, call drops and call quality has a direct relationship to the amount of spectrum that you have. It drops off very rapidly when there are more people crowding a particular narrow set of spectrum band than if you have a lot more spectrum to play with.
Okay, so now that India sort of the sector has matured a little more, do you think now there is a chance for these bandwidth allocations to increase such that we finally have better health in the cell phone network?
There's been a lot of consolidation in the sector. So right now there are maybe 3 big telcos in the market. Jio is the biggest player in that space because Jio, I guess we'll talk about Jio in some length later, but Jio came in from the data route.
Right.
They came in a sense, data first. They used a technology called voice over LTE, which they were able to optimize much better. In this market, in this technology, the first mover is actually at a huge disadvantage because the first mover picks up a lot of cost. And then, in time, the government kept liberalizing the regulations, particularly the regulations on the sharing of resources, which really allowed later comers into the market to come in at a much lower initial fixed cost.
Right. So till a point, then you had to set up your own towers and so on, and later.
Yeah. So once the problem with setting up your own towers is if you've got, let's say, 4 operators in a particular circle, then you'll have 4x the number of towers.
Right.
Sometimes 4x the number of towers you need. There are many problems with this. Of course, one is it's just terribly ugly to see lots of towers on tops of buildings. Secondly, there's interference that comes when towers are not optimally positioned. And so the more effective way to do this would be to have the tower infrastructure as just a long tower to which you can attach some gensets to give you uninterrupted power, but that's about it. And then have the radiating equipment, which is essentially those antenna, the microwave link back to the base station, as well as the antenna which will send the radio waves to your phone. Just erect that, and each telco will just erect that. So that's the first innovation that they made. They allowed passive sharing of infrastructure, which meant that if there is passive infrastructure that's involved, any type of passive infrastructure, that can be shared between telcos.
Okay.
What that did immediately was it allowed 2 or 3 telcos to place their radiating equipment on the same tower.
Okay.
This allows a lot more synergy. It allows, it just allows a more uniform use of the spectrum. There's a limit to this as well. I'm not a technical expert, but I think that beyond 3 antenna, maybe 4, you start coming into interference problems even on a single tower.
Okay.
So there is a limit to how much you can do that. But the moment you do this, if you just think about a new telco coming in, they don't have to spend on the tower anymore. They just need to spend on the radiating in the equipment. And then the next innovation, of course, is active sharing, where there's technology that's available, it's been available for some time, where you just have the same radiating equipment, but in the back end, you can bifurcate the use of the frequency, such that with the same antenna, you can, 2 telcos can use that same piece of equipment.
Okay, so it's sort of like a multi-band antenna.
Correct.
Beaming out.
Correct. And the challenge with this, of course, is that all of this is linked to revenue. So we need to know whose call it is. And
Right.
we need to have the technology in the back end to ensure that you can split those 2. But that moves to greater efficiencies. And everything in this space is how do you get the maximum number of callers on the minimum amount of spectrum. The more you can squeeze in, and every evolution of technology, from the early 2G to 3G to 4G now and 5G coming up, that's really the game. How well you can divide up that spectrum to put more people on the same sort of band.
And so you mentioned competition, and then you mentioned sort of very intensive focus on resource utilization and sharing. Do you think that's been instrumental in driving down costs the way we've seen? Is Indian telecom cheaper than most other places in the world?
By some metrics, this is probably the cheapest anywhere in the world.
And why is it the cheapest?
Intense competition, for one. So really, you can't ignore the fact that a lot of the prices were brought down just by that very aggressive competition between the telcos, which continues to till today. When Jio came in with this data first thing, and everyone had to just rejig their entire data plan to keep up with what Jio was doing. And this has happened. When Uninor came in. Uninor came in saying, "Look, we're not going for all these fancy plans. We're a completely prepaid market, and we're just going." To target those parts of the society that Airtel and Vodafone are ignoring. And immediately you do that, you start cannibalizing some of the people who are already on Airtel and Vodafone. And so they then need to rejig their plans for that. So when Vodafone came in, it was, look, there's this big international brand that's coming in. And so the existing players then had to rethink what they were doing. So these are the sorts of things that competition drives. But certainly, things like sharing and strategically bringing in regulations to encourage things that at the appropriate time in the development of the market was very helpful in bringing this down. I think if they hadn't brought in passive sharing, and they brought in passive sharing, I think just before Vodafone came into India.
Okay.
Straight after that, Vodafone, Idea and Airtel, I think, set up India's largest tower company at that time. They basically hived off their tower assets from all these big telcos. So if you think about it, up until then, every telco had rolled out its own network of towers, the tower plus the radiating equipment.
Right.
Once passive sharing was allowed, what they could do is they could map all their relative towers, and they could say, look, I have a particular gap in this area, but Idea has a tower there. So I don't need to build a tower there. I can just use Idea's tower, and Idea has a gap somewhere else, and they can use mine. And there was a much more comprehensive mapping that took place because people could share each other's towers. And what that did was, as I said, there was greater efficiencies. The way they deployed capital after this was also much more measured, because then three people were saying, look, all three of us need to have towers in all of these areas. And so, we will split the cost, and I know I can share on yours and you can share on mine. And so that's how we will roll it out hereafter, instantly bringing down the capital cost required to roll out the network from there. But they couldn't have done it earlier than that, because it needed to get to that level of density for this sort of cooperation to make sense.
Right.
And that's why I said when I started out, I don't know if they did it by accident or by design, but the net effect is that at the appropriate time, we brought in passive sharing, which really allowed us to roll things out much faster. And straight after that, once passive sharing was, we had these tower companies. The next round of auctions, the companies like, Uninor and all the other companies that came in, I think Videocon and Etisalat and all of these people, they didn't have to invest in hard infrastructure at all. All they needed to do was just get this radiating equipment and do tower deals. And with that, almost overnight, they could cover the entire country.
So you have all of this innovation happening in the private sector, perhaps driven significantly by competition as well. Could you tell us a little more about that? What kind of business innovations happened apart from tower sharing, which might have enabled the growth of the sector? Even the idea of a prepaid model was reasonably Indian, right? Because if the idea was, how do you figure out systems where you have millions of new subscribers who regularly pay you monthly, and if the solution is, okay, take the money ahead of time, and I mean, that itself was a big innovation in getting people to pay, right?
I don't know. Maybe Indian. It's certainly a developing world kind of a solution because it's almost non-existent in the developed part of the telecom world. But there have been a number of these sorts of innovations in India. I think I don't know if there's a financial model around this, but even the concept of a missed call is uniquely Indian.
Oh, yeah.
And the reason for the missed call, of course, goes back to the time when the called party pays was the earlier model around which telecom charging was done. So,
Okay.
if you make a call, then even the receiver, right? The way telecom works is the person who makes the call has to pay for the call. But in those days, even the receiver of a mobile phone would have to pay for it. And so this whole concept of and until then, we didn't have caller line identification. Caller line identification was a very sophisticated thing in all the electronic exchanges when you're talking about the fixed line networks. But of course, mobile phones by default had caller line identification. Right. And the smart Indian mind said, look, I'm not going to incur a charge. It's free to make a call. I only start paying for the call when it gets picked up. So don't ever pick it up. It will tell you exactly who's calling, and usually it'll be, I'm calling to tell you I'm downstairs, come down and we can go for the movie or something like that. So I'll just give you a missed call. You'll know I'm here and we've got a pre-agreed signal. And that's a very Indian innovation.
I mean, so much so that was the company called ZipDial,
Yeah.
which even made
the entire business model around this. And once you get that basic caller line identification principle, you can extend that by saying if it rings 3 times before you disconnect, it means yes. If it rings 2 times, it means no. And you can start some very primitive messaging using these sorts of signals that basically evade the entire payment infrastructure. So you are using the infrastructure without paying for it and getting whatever you need, whatever messaging you need out of it. And that's very Indian. But I think the other sorts of things that came out of India was we've got a diaspora, and the diaspora is constantly looking for cheap ways in which to call back to friends and family in India. So there were many friends and family type schemes that came out. And these friends and family schemes leveraged data intermingled with voice. So just think of an old time Skype type of call, but that was ringing on your phone.
Right.
And so in the early days, before we had cracked down on these in some detail, there were telcos that would offer ridiculously low rates for international calling. I think even today it's quite high, but in those days, international calling was just prohibitively high. But these were being done at slightly more than local rates. And how do they do that? They brought the call, let's say from the US to India over the data networks. And then in India, a telco would actually make the connection between that IP call to the landline of the person, and then only charge sort of the local call charge, which was negligible.
Right.
And as a result of that, they bypassed the international toll that you would have otherwise had to pay to the international long distance operator. The government of India didn't like this at all because a lot of the revenues they were getting was actually out of license fee on international long distance revenue.
Okay.
And so the Indian government said, this is not allowed. You cannot interconnect data with voice. And that's part of the reason for our internet telephony regulations. Right now, we have regulations that have been in the license for close to 20 years, which essentially say that you can do a Skype call, which is a Skype to Skype call. PC to PC call, or you can do a PC to telephone call, but that telephone has to be outside of India.
Right.
And you cannot do voice to data unless you're a telco. So that even that is a relatively recent amendment. But the reason for all of this is because in the old days, we used to bypass the telecom regulations by doing this voice to data, and the Indian government was missing out on its international revenues.
Rahul, thank you so much for sort of giving us an introduction to the kind of regulatory and policy thinking that, spurred off this growth. After the short break, we'll be back to talk about the telecom sector sort of regulator. We now, all of us know about TRAI, after net neutrality at least. So maybe after the break, we'll talk a little about TRAI and how this the policy space matured even more and how we saw the growth in the 2000s.
Filter coffee is a fascinating beverage. You need to pick the right beans, blend them in the right proportion, roast them to perfection, and slow brew at the right temperature to get the perfect cup. Which is exactly like great conversations as well. You need to track down the most interesting minds, get them into their zone, and settle down for an unhurried, unscripted chat. And coffee for me is always, always, always best enjoyed with friends. I'm Karthik Nagarajan, and do share my table as I meet some of the most interesting people I know and sit them down for a strong cup of coffee and an even stronger conversation. Join me every Wednesday for a freshly brewed episode. This is not frappe. This is the Filter Coffee Podcast.
Hi, you're listening to the Pragati Podcast, and I'm your host, Pavan Srinath. We are here with Rahul Matthan today to talk about the telecom explosion that has happened in India over the last 2 or 3 decades. Rahul, I wanted to talk to you about TRAI as an institution and how the telecom sector is regulated. But before that, I wanted to ask, earlier you mentioned that, coverage and telecom penetration was one of the driving principles and goals that shaped policy from the government. Were there any other such larger imperatives that the government had while shaping telecom policy?
Obviously, there were many, but to my mind, 2 more and not so benign and beneficial as coverage and penetration. I think the other one we spoke about briefly, the government has always been focused on revenue maximization. And so, we discussed that the initial model was a fixed fee. They moved it to a licensed revenue. But throughout, the government has constantly looked to try and get the most out of the spectrum that they allow private parties to use. A good example is the 3G spectrum auction. I don't think even the government expected the 3G auction to generate this amount of revenue. But straight after that, they realized, look, auction is probably the better way to go to get more money. And of course, after that, there was a CAG report which questioned the fact that the 2G licenses were being given not through this auction mechanism. That led to the 2G scam. Of course, in hindsight, many people have said that perhaps the CAG went a little overboard in its characterization of what the revenue could have been. But let that, be that here or there. I think
the funniest story I've heard from so many people who worked in Tamil Nadu politics, especially because CAG talked about the notional loss of 1.62 lakh crores and all of that, right? The way those words get distorted, there were many who thought that the Tamil Nadu political party at the time actually took 1.62 lakh crores and they had it hidden away with them and that they were all sitting on it. So that's how bizarre that conversation sort of went off.
Yeah, that whole conversation was, first of all, I think if you think about what happened up until the 3G auction, there was a particular mechanism of issuing licenses, and it was the first come first serve mechanism. And quite frankly, what Raja did was he did exactly the same thing. Now, the evidence shows that he also intervened. According to the evidence on record, it seems that there were a certain number of people who were able to produce a large security deposit almost overnight, which would not have been possible if they didn't already know that this was the amount. And then after a certain number of people signed up, he shut the doors, as it were, and there were other people who weren't allowed. So there's certainly some hanky-panky going on. But in challenging the very model of first come, first serve, the CAG was expecting the DOT to, in hindsight, look back and change the way in which they've been doing it ever since telecom was liberalized. And that, I think, was perhaps an unfair characterization. I think certainly these sorts of things evolve over time. And the Supreme Court also came down and said, look, telecom is a scarce natural resource. And of course, that 2G scam judgment of the Supreme Court has had a ripple effect throughout many industries. Because spectrum is a scarce natural resource, equally mines and minerals is a scarce natural resource, and that resulted in a similar investigation into the coal sector. And just as 122 telecom licenses were cancelled, similarly any other sector where the state is dispensing the ability to mine either coal or oil or any of these things would be affected in a similar manner. But just to get back to the point we were discussing, this is an evidence of the way in which the government was constantly looking at getting more and more revenue out of the sector. The other example that I often give is that the new M&A regulations that came about, the earlier M&A regulations were okay, but more recently, after the 3G scam, I think it was in 2015 or so, 2014, 2015, there were new M&A regulations which essentially said that you can do acquisitions, and most of the reason why people were interested in doing acquisitions was really to accumulate spectrum. There were people who were not using smaller players. They were looking for an exit. They had valuable spectrum, and there were people who needed spectrum. As I said, the more spectrum you have, the better your quality of service. But what the M&A regulation said is you have to mark that spectrum to market, which means that all of the benefits that you could have got by picking up spectrum that was procured in an earlier license round was going to be lost, because the difference between what that company paid for the spectrum when they got it to the current price of the spectrum as of the last auction had to be paid to the government. And so no one, so even though they came up with the M&A guidelines, even though there was a crying need for consolidation in the sector, nothing happened after that. It's only in the last year where, essentially the telcos are bleeding so badly that they don't really care. That there's been this kind of consolidation, and we've now ended up, we now have only about 3 telcos if you leave BSNL out of it.
Okay, so you have revenue maximization.
Okay, so there was one more, and that's national security. We can't forget national security. The telecom licenses have got various provisions that hang on the national security threat that the government attaches to the telecom infrastructure. It's not a misplaced threat. I think, someone who controls your telecom infrastructure could do a lot of damage to you. And this started in about 2005, around about the time when Vodafone was coming into the country. At that time, if memory serves me correctly, Vodafone had a double-digit percentage stake in China Telecom, maybe less than that, but it wasn't. They didn't control it by any stretch of imagination. They had a significant shareholding in China Telecom, and at round about the same time, BSNL was looking to one of the Chinese manufacturers to buy their equipment in order to roll out their network. These two things happened roughly at the same time, and I don't know who in the DoT put 2 and 2 together. There was a fear that resulted in a set of regulatory measures that drove home the strategic importance of the telecom network. So on the one hand, there were restrictions on investments coming from unfriendly countries, in inverted commas. And that was part of the restrictions that had until then not come in to any sector of foreign investment regulation. Telecom was the first sector where they came up with this concept. And of course, up to even till today, we don't know what an unfriendly country is, but that regulation is there. And then there were restrictions on cross-holdings between players, people who had a percentage in an unfriendly country.
So this is for the network infrastructure?
No, this is for a telco. So if you're an operator, an Indian telecom operator, you cannot have a shareholder who has a stake in a telecom network in an unfriendly country.
Wow. And there is no legal clarity on what an unfriendly country is.
Well, you see, the thing is that these are foreign investment regulations which eventually need to get cleared by the FIPB, as it was in those days. And I don't know if the FIPB has ever given any detailed reasons as to why they've rejected an application. And so we never knew whether something was rejected because of this or not. And quite frankly, everyone saw this and everyone thought the worst. A lot of people divested their holdings, or people just didn't invest because of this. So we'll never know the counterfactual, what could have been if this wasn't there. But the second more pernicious regulatory restriction was there was very strict security conditions that were imposed onto the license. And the security conditions essentially said that before importing any equipment, you've got to get clearance. Any equipment. And
that includes a cell phone?
No, this is for the operator. So, as I said, by this time, since the actual handset would have been calculated in the AGR, everyone had taken the handset business out. So they were completely separate entities that were doing handsets, and they were not regulated entities, so it didn't matter. But certainly the towers, the radiating equipment on the towers, all of that had to be imported from outside. But given how broadly it was defined, telcos were being asked, even as they were getting software in, even like Office software, Microsoft Office, was all being held up because all of this was equipment or was, inputs into the manufacture, into the telecom business, and it needed a permission. And so, there was 6 months delay in the rollout of things. It was a terrible time. And the government wasn't very helpful in trying to deal with that. I think you can see the language reflected in the license today, because there are specific mentions of you've got to ensure that there are no black boxes, there's no backdoors into your network. And telcos aren't technical people, so if someone sells them a box, there's no way they can figure out whether there's a backdoor or not. Let's say it's a Huawei or a ZTE box. It is what it is. And Nokia and Ericsson may have the same backdoors into it. And we've heard all of this stuff about NSA and Prism and things like that. And you really don't know the truth of what is in these hardware devices. But the Indian government was very, very concerned about that. So that's the other example of this paranoia around national security. The other example of this, of course, is during the Mumbai terror attacks. The Indian government realized that the terrorists in the Taj and in the Oberoi were communicating with their handlers using BlackBerry Messenger, and they couldn't get in to those messages because, of course, BlackBerry is end-to-end encrypted. And so, as you probably recall, there was a big push by the government to get BlackBerry to bring its servers into India. That was the first data localization regulation. Of course, now we've got tons of data localization regulations, including the new e-commerce policy. But at that point in time, it was driven very much by national security requirements, because they said we cannot again have a situation where there are people within India who are doing anti-national activities, and we're not able to intercept. So the license today has got a number of legal intercept provisions. This is not uncommon in telecom licenses around the world, but this whole concept of legal intercept, the requirement now to connect to the centralized monitoring system, all of these come from this sort of heightened concern around the strategic importance of the telecom network. And I think it's not misplaced, but I think people need to understand how deeply pervasive it is, and the fact that the mobile networks that we rely on so heavily actually have a number of backdoors built in to the design that law enforcement agencies can just plug into it pretty much any time.
So could you tell us a little more about that? How would that work? One, with our sort of national security forces and sort of defense considerations. Second, with the police when it comes to, say, wiretapping or snooping. I mean, those are the traditional terms that we use. I don't know if they make sense anymore. But listening into private conversations, could you give us a sense of how that happens in India right now?
So the regulations, 419A of the Telegraph Act. So essentially, we had some cases where there was wiretapping that was taking place, and then the Supreme Court said you can't do this, enact rules, and that's how 419A came about. And these rules essentially say that you cannot do any interception of telephone of calls, I guess. I'm not exactly sure how it's worded, whether it includes data as well. But you cannot do interception unless there's an order from a secretary of the Ministry of Home Affairs, or the equivalent in the state if it's something to do with the state. And I think under certain circumstances it can be a joint secretary, but essentially it's a reasonably high level functionary in the executive who has to order it. So that is the rule which applies to this.
So there is no many of us have grown up on American sort of legal television, and so there is no judge and there is no warrant that you need to sign.
No.
Nothing
And so,
like that.
I mean, in the US system, they have what they call the FISA court, and the FISA court really operates for mass surveillance, and so there's no equivalent in the Indian scenario. But if there is an interception that has to take place, there needs to be you need to go through the process in 419A, and that's the way in which it's supposed to work.
And this applies both to sort of individual interception and also mass. So if someone
There's
wants
no distinction, and I think in the modern age, individual surveillance seems to be, to my mind, would be the exception. I mean, I think given what technology can do right now, I'm sure. And once again, I don't know what exactly is happening. All of this is conjecture on my part. I think we're getting some data from the big tech companies because they're now starting to publish some transparency reports, which is giving us some sense of what sort of requests are coming to them. None of the telcos published this, to the best of my knowledge, and I'm just thinking that it would be in many orders of magnitude higher in terms of what they're doing. Now, in the early days, you needed to actually go to the telco, and a lot of the telco licenses, all the telco licenses, had specific provisions saying that you need to have a separate room which you will make available for law enforcement when they come. You need to have X number of lines which are dedicated such that the law enforcement agencies who want to do it can come in and listen in to certain calls, etc., etc. That has been changed to what they call always-on connection to the centralized monitoring system. There's a central nerve center which can plug into wherever they want at what time. Now, my understanding is that the CMS is not fully operational right now, but all the licenses have provisions which say that you have to connect, that the telcos have to connect, make available a connection to the CMS.
So you have then now these three very different imperatives that are now guiding telecom policy, right? National security, revenue maximization, and more coverage and telecom penetration. So in all this, we also have an independent regulator, TRAI, we are still a country which is trying to figure out what an independent regulator is and what they should do and so on, right? With sort of the heavy presence of the government in every field as of, 30 years ago to where we are now. So how do you see the role of TRAI? What do they regulate, and are they independent? Can you tell us a little more about this institution?
So, TRAI is certainly an independent regulator. The way I'm not an expert on all regulators, but I think this is one of our best, most robust regulators. Now, unfortunately, it has been progressively made toothless since the time it was created. It was initially created further to a court direction, which said that you can't, the government can't be both the regulator as well as the licensor. And so we need to have a separate independent regulator. Some of our obligations under TRIPS as well required for us to set up an independent telecom regulator.
This is the global trade and intellectual property agreements, right?
Yes, under the Global Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. So this is our obligation to ensure a open market for foreign participation as well. And so for these reasons, TRAI was set up, and TRAI was supposed to be an independent regulator. But given the nature of telecom and the fact that telecom is still very much governed through licenses, the sovereign ability to decide whether a new license could be issued or not was something that the state wanted to keep for itself. So even though TRAI started making recommendations on all of these things, the National Telecom Policy was amended to, in some senses, defang TRAI.
So TRAI does not award the licenses. That is by the Department of Telecom, Government of India.
Correct.
Okay. So the DOT is still a big player that way.
The DOT is, in many ways, the DOT is actually the regulator. Because today, your regulations in the sector are reflected in the licenses that the telcos have. And that license essentially is a contract between the licensor, which is the DOT, and the telco, which is the licensee. All the material provisions of regulation are actually clauses of that license. So we just spoke about the security conditions. It is an actual section in the UL, the Unified License, which speaks about security.
So, but in this, would TRAI enforce that regulation then? So the license has a bunch of conditions that the Department of Telecom might have enacted through law and delegated legislation. But then TRAI, does that work with?
No, right now TRAI's only jurisdiction is with regard to tariffs. So TRAI in many ways actually says, what the tariffs, it can't be higher than a certain amount, is the way they work. But even that is largely irrelevant, given that we've got such competitive pricing that no one is hitting the ceilings on anything.
I remember rulings from TRAI several years ago, either banning bulk SMSs or fixing costs or ceilings and that.
That's essentially the way we. So it does tariffs. It also does quality of service. So that's the second thing that they do is really look at things like call drops and things like that. So that is the other thing that they focus on.
No, but when they look at that, can they haul a company up because their quality of service is very bad?
They can.
Okay.
And they issue all sorts of recommendations like, if the call is dropped within a minute, then you have to refund the cost. And they've experimented with a lot of these sorts of things.
So this is why the net neutrality discussion happened in TRAI, because again,
so let me come to the second.
Let me
come to the okay. So in a sense it does, but net neutrality is a complicated issue because net neutrality goes to various other structural things.
Right. But it was also a tariff-related issue, right?
It was a tariff-related issue, but not directly. So, net neutrality essentially was being pushed through the free basics model. And in the free basics model, the question was that the telcos are certainly going to charge someone. And if they're going to charge an intermediary who is then going to give it off for free to all the subscribers, how do you deal with something like that? So it was a more complicated model, but still, TRAI had a very strong role to play in that. And this brings me to the other role of TRAI, which is the recommendatory role of TRAI.
Okay.
So TRAI now picks up any issue, pretty much any issue that involves the sector, and issues consultation papers. So essentially they say, look, we are thinking about such and such issue, let's say mobile virtual network operators. And we're now issuing a consultation, and we would like stakeholders to come in and say what they think. But before they do that, they actually do an extremely comprehensive analysis of the state of regulation, not just in the country, but all over the world. In fact, I've spoken to telecom professionals around the world, and a lot of them say if we're looking at a new issue, we first see if TRAI has got a consultation or a recommendation out, because to our minds, that is one of the most comprehensive analysis of telecom regulations around the world. And then they hold these consultations where people submit comments, sometimes very, very detailed, and have open houses where people can actually come to a physical place and have discussions. And then after all of that, they issue recommendations. And the TRAI recommendations are extremely well thought through. And they've done it on many sectors. Now, the problem with all of this is that this recommendation of TRAI is not binding on the DOT. And very often the DOT has chosen to ignore the TRAI's recommendations. And one would even say that there is some sort of tension between these two entities. This is unfortunate in my mind, because I think a lot of the robustness that TRAI brings to policy formulation is something that is slowly leaking out to the other areas of government. With the privacy law, Justice Sri Krishna followed a very similar model. He had a white paper which he issued. He asked for comments, and then he did a roadshow. He went to many cities in the country and had these physical meetings. We're starting to see a lot more of the policies in the country being put out for public consultation before the final law is passed. And all of that, I think, owes its origins to the way in which TRAI looked at this. TRAI did that because the area they were regulating was a complex area. It involved the interface of new technologies, where they were looking for people who had expertise, who could say, does this technology really work this way? Are there any unintended consequences of it? It was also going to roll out to a sector where there were a number of people already doing all sorts of things, and how is it going to affect them? So it's a good way to regulate in this age of technology, where there are so many stakeholders, and the impact of technology could be much more complex than any regulator could be expected to see. And it's unfortunate that we have a situation where you get such good, robust thinking, but the regulator is not even slightly bound to push that out. It's gotten better. So, I think the relationship between TRAI and DOT is improved. And so we're not seeing any of the turf wars that we used to see maybe a decade ago. But I still think TRAI could be much better used in terms of the way in which it functions.
Does TRAI as a regulator also have any dispute resolution roles?
It used to when it was first enacted, but that has been hived off into the TDSAT, so the Telecom Dispute Tribunal. So now all disputes are brought before TDSAT. So essentially, TRAI used to be a regulator and a dispute resolution authority. Now all it does is just do recommendations. Doesn't do the disputes, and also it can only adjudicate on something as small as tariffs, which quite frankly, in the competitive nature of our market, they don't really have very much to do there.
Wow. Okay. So this image that we have of TRAI as this all-powerful regulator, at least, that's one image that I had, is not
the reality.
Not the reality at all.
It's a pity, as I said. It is a good regulator.
So comparatively, a regulator like, say, SEBI would have a lot more power within their domain?
Correct.
Okay. Of course, RBI is this umbrella which does a lot of things, but SEBI, I thought...
So SEBI is very much on securities, RBI is on banking.
Right.
And if you look at the financial services sector, you've got SEBI, PFRDA, IRDA, and the RBI. Between the four of those regulators, they have very well-defined areas of regulation. And SEBI will only look at anything to do...
And within their domain, they will do dispute resolution, they'll come up with...
No, in all of these, so dispute resolution, in my mind, is best done by a tribunal in a specialized area.
Okay.
It doesn't make sense for the regulator to do dispute resolution, because then if there are disputes against the regulator or against what the regulator is thinking about, you're a judge in your own cause, and that's not efficient. Even though, in the tax department right now, your first dispute is within the tax department.
Right.
Until it goes past tribunal into the High Court.
Help us understand what a regulator is, because if this function of sort of dispute resolution is umpiring, right? So sort of who's more right, who's more wrong, how do we split this sort of conflict that is arising? So you're saying that umpiring role can be separate, that's like a specialized court, right? A tribunal of some sort. Then what, because, we use this word regulation all the time, but it means so many different things to so many different people. So clearly TRAI is not an extremely powerful regulator, but what would a powerful regulator do then?
So in the telecom sector, I think, we've got new technologies and new circumstances that keep coming up. Right now, one of the biggest challenges that the telecom sector is facing is how to deal with OTT players, over-the-top players. So the way telecom is designed is that the regulator regulates the pipes. The data pipe is regulated through the ISPs, through the carriage operators. So these are the people who carry it across state boundaries and up until the international gateway and across the international gateway. So now that is infrastructure.
Right.
But there are a lot of people, and those are the big players today, that are providing very, very sophisticated services on top of the infrastructure. So you take, Skype, you take Google Chat, you take all of these players. They are doing essentially what take WhatsApp, for example. They are essentially doing everything that a telco is doing with none of the infrastructure. So they are using the data layer that is now all pervasive. And you can do a WhatsApp call, which, when spectrum is really bad, is probably better than doing a mobile PSTN call. They're doing SMS, which is their chat, and they're doing it much more efficiently because they have really cool features like you can send images, you can have group chats and things like that, which all takes something which is above and beyond what the regular telco can do. So essentially, they are providing a communication service which is running on top of and therefore not regulatable by the telecom regulator. And the question is, what do we do with these people? Nothing in our framework, which is dependent on the utilization of spectrum, allows us to regulate people who don't use spectrum at all. So that, I think those sorts of issues need to come up before a regulator who needs to apply his mind and say, okay, this is a new paradigm. And this is the way in which we will regulate these people, or we will decide we're not going to regulate them at all. But that whole process is what we expect a regulator to do.
So in that sense, it's not so much an umpire role as much as setting the rules of the game.
Correct.
Role.
Correct.
And that's
so the umpiring needs to be done by a completely independent entity that wasn't involved in setting the rules of the game.
Right.
And the person who sets the rules in the game, to my mind, the ideal person, needs to be able to take a look at all the stakeholders who will get affected. And having heard what every stakeholder has to say, has a view of what is good in the overall interests of the nation.
Right.
They need to, even if they're not represented, think about what the consumer, the actual subscriber what's best for them. They need to think about what's good for national security. They need to think about, what's good for commerce, because in a free market kind of environment, if it's not good for commerce, people are not going to do it. And then come up with a decision. This is the ideal regulator. Now, very often regulators tend to be influenced by one or more stakeholders to the detriment of someone else. And you can't win everything, but a good regulator will get that balance right.
Right. So with this over the top and the internet challenge that's come in, there are sort of two challenges there, right? One is sort of incumbent telecom service providers and internet service providers losing out on capturing a lot of the value, right? A lot of the value that they were able to provide now is being captured by
Correct.
these people who are using their network. So there's a lot of heartburn involved as well.
Correct.
Second is who has even the jurisdiction to regulate any
on
of
the
these?
Current paradigm.
On the current paradigm.
Because as we said that a lot of the authority, and so now this is the other weird thing. We don't have a modern law, which governs the internet and cellular telephones. We still have the Indian Telegraph Act, which was designed, it's called the Telegraph Act, which is basically Morse code equipment, which was drafted by the British. And now that's the law under which all these modern technologies are being governed.
We still have the stage carriage and the contract carriage laws that apply to Uber and Ola and cab aggregators. Right?
Things like that, yeah.
So we have this 100-year, 150-year problem.
Yeah.
And so you have that. So and now, I think in our past discussions on data protection and privacy, there is talk of perhaps a new regulator of some sort or some data protection authority of some sort.
That will only be for data.
Right.
But we do need someone to think about the modern technology in a way that is not linked to the Telegraph Act. And from the Telegraph Act, we said anything that essentially the Telegraph Act covers anything, any technology that will allow you to communicate using electromagnetic waves or any sort of those sorts of waves. Now, if you break it down to its constituent elements, yes, the internet does use that sort of protocol to communicate, but that's no longer what you're regulating. Right now, you're thinking about fake news and you're thinking about all of these other issues. That is independent of what the underlying infrastructure is, and that needs to be regulated in some manner. The DOT and TRAI and maybe the courts also think that this is something that the DOT and TRAI should regulate. But that doesn't draw any substance from the underlying statute at all. And so we've got to come up with a new paradigm to regulate all of these things, because I think otherwise someone is certainly going to question. I think if I was an OTT player, I would say, look, I'm not operating a telegraph. And one of the requirements of the Telegraph Act is the people who are regulated by it must be operating a telegraph. The ISP is operating a telegraph because the ISP has got a switch and they've got wires and they use spectrum. But, WhatsApp, Facebook, Google, they don't have any of these things. So how do you regulate them? And I think that's a challenge for the new age. Most other countries that have got a colonial past have probably laws very similar to the Telegraph Act, have enacted, in the early 2000s, they've enacted all sorts of modern telecom regulations. India is still stuck with the Telegraph Act, and I think there's a limit to how far you can stretch the Indian Telegraph Act to cover modern technologies.
So now that we've come to where we are today in 2019, right? We've got, 70% at least of the Indian population having cell phones. We have perhaps at least 30 or 35% of our population having smartphones. And
smartphone numbers, yeah.
I mean, they say 500 million broadband connections. Even that word broadband is a very desi definition of broadband, right?
That's okay. As long as, it's data.
512 kbps and above. As of 2010 or 11. Before,
but the good thing, and this is, we spoke about innovation as well. Even with that low bandwidth, we've optimized to be able to run streaming media in a appropriate way for the screen on which it is being served. These are all optimizations,
right? And lots of optimization on the private sector as well, right? So you have YouTube, for example, which in India allows you to download
exactly
and save a video. I don't think they allow that in most other markets.
It's not even relevant. Why would you do it if you've got high-speed internet connection on the tap all the time, right? You just play it. You wouldn't do it if it wasn't for the fact that it will be spotty in a particular place and you'd like to watch that movie without buffering.
So with all of that, and with the talk of 5G already starting, where do you think Indian policy should go to be able to reap the next level of benefits from our telecom and internet infrastructure?
I think it's important to start to think about all of this slightly differently. I think as I started out saying, there is an infrastructure layer. And that infrastructure layer needs to be regulated in a very different way. And then there is the actual customer-facing layer. Earlier, when we were rolling this out, we needed the same person to roll out the infrastructure as well as interact with the customer. As I said, when we did passive infrastructure sharing, we started moving a lot of that out. I think it's come to the time where anyone who provides the infrastructure, whether it's for a voice call or a data call, needs to be treated as infrastructure alone. We need to have a separate set of regulations for content, for the services that are operating across the network, and we shouldn't be thinking about it in the same terms as we thought about telecom regulation. So we shouldn't be applying license fee, which is some percentage of revenue. In fact, I don't even think we should apply any license fee to this, because that's not the purpose of regulating this. The purpose of regulating this layer is to ensure that certain national security interests or certain interpersonal interests are maintained, and therefore we should think about that.
And the network stays healthy and deep and vast.
Yes,
right?
Yes, and I think a lot of the penetration of just communication. Has, ever since Jio came particularly, has been very much over the data networks. And we've got to allow innovations to allow us to be completely agnostic to whether we're penetrating it using spectrum or whether we're penetrating it using something which sits on top of the spectrum and is very clever and innovative on top of that. So I think that's the way in which the Indian regulator needs to start thinking. Unfortunately, today, the way in which they're thinking is they're still trying to peg it back to the fact that you need to be licensed. Why does an over-the-top player need to be licensed at all? Currently, they're not licensed, and without the license, they have spread many benefits, far more than the government could have spread if they had come in and licensed them. What certainly we need to tackle is some menaces, and I don't think regulation will be the answer to fake news, but certainly some form of regulation is going to improve content delivery, perhaps rural networks, and there are many such innovations that we should be thinking about in the sector. I don't think we'll be able to implement any of them unless we can properly segregate the network layer from the layer on top.
So the good news over the last couple of years is perhaps because of Aadhaar and for other reasons, we've at least started a very strong data protection conversation in India.
Correct.
But perhaps we are yet to have this, how do you think about regulating the internet conversation in India in an important way?
I mean, the way we're regulating the internet, unfortunately, is we're holding ISPs, we're holding intermediaries liable, and we're holding them liable under residual provisions of various statutes. So, if you want to get after someone, you'll issue a direction to the ISP saying, shut that website down.
Right.
And that's not what the ISP should be doing. I mean, you've got to have another mechanism to go after a website that is doing something which is illegal, other than, using this control over the faucet to just switch the data off to that particular location. And so, I think we have to have a different approach to this, because I think it's really important to keep the underlying infrastructure always working.
Right.
And I don't think it's healthy to switch off, when there's, riots or some civil disturbance in parts of the country, the government just switches the internet off. I mean, increasingly it's going to become extremely dangerous to do, because many, hospitals will run on data, many essential services will run on data, and if you use this sort of a ham-fisted approach to prevent people spreading messages, if the only thing you can do is switch off the underlying pipe, people will die. If life support depends on internet-based services, it would be extremely dangerous. And I think the government's got to realize that increasingly more and more of the services that we provide are data dependent. And it is no longer an option, like it is no longer an option to switch off the electricity. If there's some sort of a riot, you can't just switch electricity off. Electricity is always on. Now, data is going to be electricity, and it's going to be that thing which powers a lot of the services that the government, either the government or private sector is providing, and you can't just switch it off like they do now. And I can see what they're looking to regulate. I think in certain circumstances, messages could spread, could make things much worse. But you can't switch off the internet to prevent that. And where we find the answer between those two competing interests is what the regulators need to really focus on.
Rahul, thank you so much for coming on the Pragati podcast again and talking about telecom regulation and how the sector has really been shaped sort of willy-nilly by so many forces, by deliberate government action, by private innovation and competition, and a plethora of competing interests. And in spite of all of that, or perhaps because of all of that, we are in a place today where we do have a telecom and internet sector that I think we can be reasonably proud of.
Absolutely. And we've got probably one of the most successful telecom. If you look post-liberalization, this is the one sector that is a poster child for the liberalization and the opening up of the economy. Thank you for having me. It's been a great conversation.
Thanks, Rahul. Thank you for listening till the end. If you like the Pragati podcast and listen to us on iTunes or Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating and a review. It will mean a lot to us. And if you have any suggestions on what you would like us to discuss on future podcasts, please send me a tweet at ZeusIsDead or send me an email to podcast@thinkpragati.com. The Pragati podcast can be accessed at thinkpragati.com and ivmpodcast.com. You can subscribe to the show on the IVM Podcast app or any other podcast app. We are there on all platforms and as of last week also on Spotify. Subscribe today.
Advertising is dead. Yep, you heard me right. Advertising is dead. We're all in the content business now. Let's not call it news, TV, radio, etc., etc. It's all content, and we're in the middle of this weirdly exciting phase where all the borders and lines that have been drawn over decades has been swept away by this lovely thing called the internet. We're a show where we don't dwell on just the stuff that is now, but rather the wider stuff about advertising, media, content, and the whole goddamn circus surrounding it. Tune in every Tuesday for our weekly unboxing of the mystery box we used to call advertising. I'm Varun Dugirala, co-founder and content chief at The Glitch, and this is my new podcast, Advertising is Dead.
Hello, everybody. We have a brand new daily podcast we're working on with Bloomberg Quint. All you need to know provides the top news on business, markets, and the economy so that you can stay ahead of the curve. Tune in every morning on BloombergQuint.com, the IVM Podcast app, or wherever you get your podcasts from.